I was born in Shreveport in 1934, the depth of the Depression. My father had the same name. I'm Junior. He was Jacques L. Wiener. My mother was Betty E. Wiener. She was from Little Rock. I have only one sibling, my sister Marion Wiener Weiss, who was married to my law school classmate and eventual partner in the law firm, Donald Weiss. In Shreveport, I went to Southfield School through the 8th grade, and then one of the only two public high schools, C.E. Byrd, which is now one of many, and I graduated from high school in 1952 and went to Tulane. I ended up majoring in English, minor in political science, and I was in a fraternity, ZBT, and I ended up being president of the local chapter of ZBT. I was editor-in-chief of the yearbook, the Jambalaya. I was president of the student body for arts and sciences, and I was a student officer in the Naval ROTC. When I went to college in 1952, the Korean War was still on, and almost every male student, not just at Tulane but everywhere, joined the ROTC to avoid being drafted and going in as an enlisted man. If we went, we wanted to be officers, and I chose the Naval ROTC. When I graduated in 1956, the Korean War was over, but I was committed by being in the Naval ROTC to serve 2 years. I elected to go to the Supply Corps, so I went to the University of Georgia, where the Naval Supply School was, for 3 months, and then I was assigned to the USS Altair, a marine retail supply ship. We would take bulk supplies from freighters and other kind of ships, and then distribute them in retail to the other ships of the fleet. And my ship was home ported in Barcelona, Spain, so that was an extra benefit. It was wonderful to be in Barcelona in those days. I graduated from Tulane Law School in the class of '61. As mentioned earlier, my brother-in-law, Donald Weiss, and I were classmates. We were fortunate enough to graduate first and second in the class. I was first, he was second. And that meant we were Order of the Coif and Law Review, of course. And he and I then went back to Shreveport, and with my father formed the firm of Wiener, Weiss, and Wiener, which is now Wiener, Weiss, and Madison. We soon realized that we were doing very much the same kind of practice, very little litigation, a lot of tax and family planning and oil and gas and closely held investments. So we decided after a few years that we needed to expand, and we brought in the Madison brothers, John and Jim, and then Fleet Howell. One time in Shreveport, my wife and I and another couple were at a dinner club, and Senator Bennett Johnston and his mother were there, and they came by the table on their way out and spoke, and Bennett turned to me and said, "I guess you've heard all the trouble I'm having finding someone to go on the Fifth Circuit. every time I come up with a nominee, that I get a problem. And I said, well, maybe it's because you are trying to nominate a Democrat, and it's a Republican-controlled Congress, Senate. And I said, if you run out of Democrats, think about throwing my name in. And he said, I didn't know you were a Republican, but I had changed to the Republican Party. And about 3 weeks later, I was in Colorado fly fishing with a friend who drove up and yelled at me across the water, when you land that trout, you need to call your office. So I did, and they gave me a number in Washington, D.C. to call, and I got invited to come up for an interview or several interviews for that purpose. And that eventuated into a nomination to the bench, and but I had a small quarrel with Senator Breaux, so the Democrats had decided they would hold 17 seats rather than confirming them, because that had happened reversed to them previously. And Senator Breaux suggested I be one of the 17. So President Reagan went out of office, but when President Bush the first was elected, he renominated me, and Senator Breaux did not oppose it. I got a call from the White House while I was in New Orleans for a Louisiana Law Institute council meeting, and they said that they had found out that the Congress was going to adjourn early, and if I did not get nominated and submitted, they'd have to start the process all over in January. So they said, try to call the White House. I did. I couldn't get President Bush. I did again when I got to a hunting camp, because it happened that this weekend was opening day of duck season. And I tried from the camp, and again didn't get him, but left the camp's number. The next morning I was hunting with my host, and the Cajun manager of the duck club came out in a boat and looked over at us, and instead of coming to the blind, stopped and said to me, "Are you the Mr. Wiener what knows President Bush?" in his Cajun accent. I said, "No, I don't know him. Why?" And he said, "Well, they called here, and I told them you were out hunting. Call back in an hour." Well, that afternoon I went fishing with my host, and we got back after catching our limits of speckled trout. And my cousin Bill Wiener said, the Camp David called here looking for you. And I asked him, "How was your hunting today?" I don't think he really did that, but he was needling me. So it's, again, I missed the president. Sunday we finished up the hunt, and I went home and got a call on my home phone, and it was President Bush. And we talked, and he said, "I understand you were duck hunting. I'm envious." And I said, "Well, if you knew that we had also caught our limit of fish, you'd be doubly jealous, because I know you've had trouble off Maine catching a striped bass." So we had a very nice conversation. In 1997, I married Sandy, my current wife, and she had a house, 3 children, and a law practice in New Orleans, and it was easy for me to move to New Orleans, particularly since New Orleans is the headquarters of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeal. So I did just that, set up a chambers in the headquarters, which is now known as the John Minor Wisdom Court of Appeals building. When I came on the bench, Judge John Minor Wisdom was still hearing cases. He was on senior status and well into his 80s, but he was still here. And of course, everyone admired him, and I was among those who did. And I took every opportunity to work with him, converse with him, get to know him better, hear some of his war stories, and sit on 3 judge panels with him. In fact, as fate would have it, the last panel that he sat on was with Judge Politz and me. Having grown up in Shreveport, and I did many of the things that my father had done. My father was a very avid fisherman and waterfowl hunter, and he started taking me along on duck hunts locally and around Shreveport before I was even old enough to shoot. I just went and watched. And he would take me fishing the same way locally. And as I grew older and became proficient with casting rods and shotguns, I would go first with him and eventually on my own. I stopped my trap shooting during college, and of course in the Navy, and then even in law school. But when I moved back to Shreveport, married and a father, I went back to trap shooting, and I won a number of the state championships in a couple of zone, which is other states, including Louisiana. Hunted and fished in a number of places. As far as the hunting, it was all birds, anything with feathers, but nothing with fur. And the fishing, I started by freshwater fishing for largemouth bass in and around Shreveport, but expanded that to the Gulf of Mexico. And then eventually, when I got into fly fishing, I went many places in North America, and one of my favorite trips I made 3 times was to Russia, who I developed a friendship with, was Sandra Day O'Connor, and that came from fishing. She and I were both invited to a friend's home in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, to fly fish for trout. She had just taken it up. That's where I met her. She and our host were friends, and we developed quite a fishing friendship. I went to Washington, D.C. one time and looked her up, and Sandy was with me, and we went to her house in nearby Maryland, and in the backyard practiced fly fishing. She wanted some hints to fly casting, not fishing, in her backyard. But that led eventually to a trip to Alaska. One of the cases that I was particularly involved in was one called Adar versus Smith. And that was a case in which a Louisiana baby was put up for adoption and was adopted by an unmarried male couple from, I think, New York, but I know they took the baby to New York and adopted him. And then they came back to Louisiana to get a corrected birth certificate, and the powers that be refused to do that. And I wrote an opinion for the panel, 3-judge panel, that reverse the district court or possibly affirm the district court. I can't remember how the district court ruled, but at any rate, we unanimously ruled that that full faith and credit demanded that Louisiana recognize the New York adoption, even though it was two males and they weren't married. And that case was taken en banc, and I lost it. Even the two members of my panel flip-flopped and went the other way and joined the majority of the en banc court that reversed our opinion. But I had a lot of fun writing the dissent from the en banc panel, and one of the fun things about it was that the Louisiana official had offered to change the birth certificate to show one but not both of the adoptive parents, either one. And one of the things I said in the opinion was that I knew of full faith and credit, but I'd never heard of half faith and credit. So every once in a while you get to put a zinger in an opinion. I'm most proud of is the way my family, younger family, has developed. Each of the members, my 4 children, are married and still married to their first spouses. I have 10 grandchildren by those 4, and all of them have done amazingly well in school and socially, and very bright.